You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 324 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to talk about the terrible U.S. military-industrial complex and how it's robbing all of us. I also want to talk about some things going on with North Korea, Venezuela, and Libya. Take the time to share this show somewhere or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find it online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured on the homepage. The site's back up and running again, so all you had to do is search libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you subscribe to the show on some kind of podcatcher or YouTube, BitChute. The show's pretty much everywhere. And then also donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus if you want access to the bonus content. First up on today's show, there's an IG report out, a Pentagon IG report, looking into the F-35 project. They find that there's a missing documentation basically for $2.1 billion in parts that I believe were purchased by U.S. weapons makers, mostly Lockheed Martin and their subsidiaries. So I think sometimes, people read this headline and kind of jump to $2.1 billion is stolen or missing. I'm not saying that, that $2.1 billion is just gone and there's absolutely nothing to show for it. There are probably parts laying around, and who knows how much value all that those parts are worth. But that's the point. When, you run a company, you have to do accounting, and especially what we're talking about government contracts here. That means they have to kind of show proof that they've, spent all these monies on the parts. This is important because with the F-35, you probably have something like a seat, and that, they could say that the seat cost $5 million, because, with the ejection capabilities and the speed the planes fly at and all this other kind of stuff, and maybe it does. Or maybe it costs $500,000 because everything else they buy separately, like the ejection bots and the helmet and the parachute. And so the actual seat itself is just like kind of the metal, whatever kind of steel it is. And so it doesn't cost that much. And so there's room for corruption and embezzlement and just stealing of public funds if this isn't tracked. So the Inspector General report was very critical, saying how could the Pentagon not have this information? And they're looking to go, to Lockheed Martin or whoever else has spent this money to say, hey, show us some receipts. Unfortunately, I don't think anything's going to happen if, the receipts don't turn up. Kind of shrug, we weren't supposed to keep them. You guys were supposed to be doing that. And if you don't have them, we don't have them, but trust us, it's all there. But it is just more evidence of, how corrupt the military-industrial complex is and how inept government is, right? Like, these are the people that are supposed to be providing us with our great defense system. And yes, they can't even do basic kind of accounting and bookwork and expense sheet work here. They're just simply kind of, letting the money go wherever and not tracking it. I think a real problem with this is that it certainly weakens the U.S. defenses. I mean, if the money for the project is all going towards the project and trying to make the plane as good as possible, well, that's going to be, what gives the American military the best plane. But the money is, kind of being funneled around and corrupted because nobody's doing good bookkeeping. Well, then the U.S. is going to end up with a plane like the F-35 that's, years behind schedule. It costs hundreds of billions of dollars more than was ever supposed to. It's had tons of problems. It's still not assessed to be all that great of a plane. It's supposed to, be the next generation of fighter. And another example I give, of course, is the Zumwalt class of destroyers. And I'm sure everybody's who listens to the show frequently has heard this, but it's a destroyer without a main weapon. The cannon costs too much. The shells, the artillery rounds cost way too much. So they scrapped it. And so now you have a, destroyer that's supposed to have the ship killing cannon on it, or, supposed to lay down some real firepower offshore, and it actually has absolutely nothing. And so it's worthless. And yeah, it costs the taxpayers billions of dollars. Another weapons issue here is the next Pentagon budget is requesting over $300 billion in hopes to test a space-based laser kind of technology in 2023. So the way I understand it, the actual weapon that would be tested in 2023 wouldn't necessarily be a weapon itself. It would be more a precursor to eventually having some kind of satellite laser that could be targeted. They say, and kind of, I'm sure will focus on this idea that it's going to be for missile defense. So they're going to say, if the North Koreans are about to launch a missile, we could hit it with this space-based missile defense. Now, the problem is the way I kind of look at it, if the U.S. can't build a destroyer with a cannon, I don't know how it's going to build space lasers that could blow up missiles with any kind of accuracy. And so it's probably just going to cost a lot of money and not produce a whole lot of results. The other issue is that it's going to provoke countries like Russia and China and who knows who else. I mean, Iran and North Korea also have space programs, and India or Brazil or Argentina may be looking to, have similar programs. And so we could see almost a new arms race headed up to space as all the countries try to develop these either missile defense technologies or, once it goes to missile defense, then we're going to put weapons up there to take out the other people's missile defense. And so then you're going to have, fighters in space because you got to protect your missile defense. And, it's just going to absolutely spin out of control. And, the actual situation will be is that the people who live on the ground just go about their lives and make everything work, produce things, not the government employees, are going to be taxed, and, their labor is going to be stolen from them. And it's going to then, be taken by the congressmen and given a lucrative contracts to these weapons makers who will produce weapons that will, work with varying degrees of use. But at the end of the day, will never actually achieve their goal of making the planet safer for the rest of us. And, we're not going to see any kind of prosperity from it. And then they're going to take some of that money and give it back to their friends in the government. And then, the rest of us are just, going to be that much poorer from the whole thing. So this is the kind of stupidity that we're looking at. And I think it's very unfortunate that, we're not looking to pursue this, especially, the big concern is the big space race and all kinds of weaponizing space arms issues. And just before I move on, this is something that I've been thinking about. One issue that I think should be looked at particular importance in the 2020 election cycle, especially among the Democrat candidates, should be their position on different nuclear arms and nuclear reduction treaties and, agreements and treaties not to weaponize space, because I really think there's a real fear and potential that we're on the verge of some of this kind of stuff with withdrawing from the INF treaty. I think the START 2 treaty, needs to be renewed soon. And unless you have somebody in there with any sense of sanity, like a Tulsi Gabbard, who's, relentlessly mocked for her, not anti-Russia enough positions, who could reasonably sit down with the Russians and the rest of the world nuclear powers and say, hey, we got to do something about these weapons. We're not going to weaponize space. We're really going to work like, Reagan and Gorbachev did to come to some real good nuclear arms reduction treaties and agreements not to weaponize space. So, if in any way we're capable of influence at all, that I think should be one of the targets. And I think that's one of the things we should make a big deal about when we can. And in this same line of thinking, yesterday on Twitter, I saw that presidential candidate in Utah, Evan McMullen, I believe is his name. He's a former CIA guy. I really don't care if I get his name right or wrong, but I think everybody should know who I'm talking about. He tweeted that that's fear-mongering to want to talk about the nuclear weapons, and that what we really need to focus on is kind of the terrorism issue and the counter-Russia issue. So it's very interesting that, they're going to now call us fear-mongers because we want to pay attention to nuclear weapons, the biggest, baddest, worst weapons we got, the ones that could kill us all. So on Venezuela, what we have is a situation mainly unfolding in the United States. The Treasury Department gave Citgo a basically 18-month waiver to continue to make debt payments to its parent company, which is the Venezuelan state oil company. So basically to the Venezuelan government. So, kind of essentially what we have here is Citgo is owned by the Venezuelan government. So, it kind of owes debt or whatever to the parent company, and they make money from Americans from selling gasoline around the country, and I'm sure doing a bunch of other stuff. And so even though the U.S. is trying to isolate Venezuela globally, they're still going to allow Citgo to make these payments back to Venezuela. I believe the Nets payment is around $71 million. So not an insignificant amount of money. I do think the status of Citgo is a very interesting topic here, because, the U.S. is trying to transfer everything into the hands of the Juan Guaido government in Venezuela, who apparently, really has no standing anymore. I'm not seeing anything in the news that would make me believe that he's gaining any kind of legitimacy in Venezuela. And I don't know if how much longer he could hold on to the presidential title where he's just not being openly mocked for it. I mean, I could call myself president, but that certainly doesn't make me the president of the United States or means anybody's going to listen to me. And I think he's quickly gained into the same position. Now, that being said, there's still a lot of work going on to undermine the Maduro government. Maybe this means the U.S. is just kind of like, well, we tried this guy, he didn't work out, so we're just going to go back to generally trying to undermine the Venezuelan government, cut it off from oil exports around the world, or selling oil around the world. So they really don't have any money coming in. The people, start to do really poorly. The government collapses, and then, we put somebody in charge. Then I guess it doesn't really seem like something that's going to work. But I don't know if the U.S. government is still attached to this, particular Juan Guaido. While we're on the subject of oil exports, the U.S. is also looking to cut Iran's oil exports to under 1 million barrels per day, currently at about 1.25 million barrels per day. So, talking about 20% decrease in Iranian oil exports. Part of, I think, the problem here is that if the U.S. is trying to cut China and India off from Venezuela, I guess more India off from Venezuela, then it's a real head scratcher as to what the United States thinks is going to happen with, if the Indians would then stop buying Iranian oil as well. I don't know how possible that is. Also, the constrictions and all the oil that the U.S. is either kind of accidentally taken off the market with their foreign policy, like Libya, Syria, and et cetera, with instability, or intentionally with sanctions and everything. How much longer is the world going to, kind of continue to go along with the U.S. choking down the global oil market like this? I mean, they may just start to say, screw you, we're going to, buy the oil because, this is what our citizens need to be most prosperous. And we really don't care what you have against Iran. They're following the nuclear deal. We're going to keep taking their oil. Yeah, Maduro has some communist problems, but it could be worse. And so we'll buy his oil as well. I mean, it seems to be the way world leaders will eventually have to go. I was recently reading an article in the National Interest on how the sanctions against Russia have played out, particularly, the deep biting sanctions that were put on after what happened in Ukraine with Crimea in 2014. And the article argues that Russia has actually kind of prospered in its isolation. I don't know if that's true because, I'll detail it in a second. I think that the conclusion from the article is too much. I just want to say this because I linked to it in the show notes page. But I do think it shows that Russia has been able to, really adapt to and get past these sanctions. Now, what happened is in 2014, it causes inflation. There's a reduction in the amount of kind of food coming into the country. So prices go up. I think at one point they were looking like year to year food inflation at 23%. So that's pretty significant, right? If, you go to the store now and a gallon of milk costs $3 and then a year from now it costs $3.75, we're talking a good amount of inflation. However, Russia has really adapted and started to invest in its own food production capabilities. And it now seems that their economy has really stabilized and adapted to the sanctions and is producing more and more of its own food. Long term, this could be a more strategic position for Russia. If the U.S. really ever needed to, because Russia was acting aggressively towards the United States, actually, saying flying nuclear capable bombers around our borders or something crazy like that, then we could use the sanctions. Russia doesn't have a lot of food production capabilities and maybe they bite a little bit harder. Now Russia's just kind of developed their food sector. And so those sanctions may be less effective. Another problem with this is that I think is a good example. It shows how much U.S. sanctions could really fluctuate a country's market. So think about this, Russia has now invested all this money into their agriculture and food production, saying, well, if we take off all those sanctions and suddenly these goods are allowed to flow back into the country, could really bring down the price of some of these goods in Russia and cause like a kind of a lot of market instability in that country. So I don't know. I find that to be kind of an interesting impact. The article, if you want to know kind of just how the Russian economy has reacted to U.S. and European sanctions following the 2014 annexation of Ukraine, it's an interesting read. All right, on the North Korea talks here, it looks like Moon Jae-in is again going to try to step in and save this whole thing, looking to have a summit with the North Korean leadership now. I haven't seen if there's been anything formal stated or how the North Koreans would respond, but it does need to happen. I think this is an important move by the South Korean president to go ahead and look to have these talks, because I think John Bolton, along with the rest of the Trump administration, really did a number on the potential for something good to come out of these talks in Hanoi with the deal they offered the North Koreans, which was obviously unacceptable. I've talked about this on the past on the show, but to summarize it real quick, it was demanding the surrender of North Korea prior to giving up any sanctions relief. Likely not only dismantling a large portion of their nuclear program, but also destroying a lot of equipment and stuff to make sure it never happens again. And then the U.S. might relieve sanctions. However, we saw the situation with Iran, where the U.S. then just backed off it, right? We said that we were going to provide them with sanctions relief and help them facilitate business growth and ties with the West in their country. And then when Trump became president, he just undid it. And so the Koreans are looking for a step-by-step process. I'm not sure how, Moon Jae-in is going to, try to repair this bridge and kind of figure out a way we could get from what the North Koreans are demanding, what the Americans are demanding, but, maybe there's steps there, or just to kind of undercut the American role and, declare peace with North Korea on his own. All right, there's a story I want to talk about. The North Korean embassy in Spain, it's in Madrid, was broken into a few days before the talks in Hanoi. From what I could tell, the kind of accepted narrative of what happened is about 10 people came in, some speaking Korean, detained the staff, isolated the chief of the embassy, and talked to him for some period of time, not in front of anybody else, and then left. So it's an interesting story, just that the Korean embassy was broken into. I think the official story is that this was likely done by a North Korean separatist group, I guess made up of defectors. The group claims to have some role in saving the life of the son of North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un's half-brother, who, famously was killed with the nerve agent in February of 2017. But other than that, there's not a whole lot I know about the group. There's a Move Alabama article that I'm linking to in the show notes page. In that article, B kind of breaks down who he thinks the group is and, goes into some detail of why he thinks they may have ties to the CIA or South Korean intelligence. And we'll say from my own take, I am so far not convinced, while it seems possible to me, that this was some kind of CIA orchestrated thing. There's no clear ties. The evidence I think is pretty loose, that it may have been the CIA or a CIA, orchestrated, backed by, we support some North Koreans who carried this out. The, I guess, big note in the circumstantial evidence that makes this seem like the CIA may have had something to do with it is that this embassy was the station of the North Korean who's leading their side of the nuclear negotiation talks. And so, there's some speculation that maybe they were looking for something on him. I'm going to wrap up today's show by talking about the migration issue across the Mediterranean Sea. Of course, following Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's absolutely disastrous and stupid war in Libya in 2011. Basically, it opened up the floodgates of people trying to get across the Mediterranean Sea into Italy from Libya, and just a gauntlet the whole way. There's militants running around Libya. ISIS controls a large portion of territory. It's inhospitable as it is. It's desert. It's dangerous. There's rampant sexual abuse, murder, kidnapping, ransoms going on. And then you get to the Mediterranean Sea and, this is a rough ride. And, we've had thousands and thousands of bodies turn up, people drowning trying to make that trip. This became, from a lot of people's views, a problem in Europe. And some countries in particular seem to have had real political movements based on their opposition to this migration. A lot of it was felt like the EU was forcing, the migration on them. And so a country like Italy developed a very anti-immigration policy and has taken some action in the past few years that does seem to have actually limited and stemmed the flow of migration. I should say over, I guess, about the past year they've been doing this. It's included a few $1 million to the Sudanese and Nigerian government in order to keep people, from leaving, I guess, their countries and traveling through Libya. The big problem I see with the Italy policy is it really equipped and supported the Libyan Coast Guard, which has a lot of evidence of being really brutal, including people winding up from captivity in the Libyan Coast Guard to captivity of people who are torturing and ransoming people. So, they hold up a cell phone, they call your loved one, and, they whip you or beat you or cut something off of you and say, if you ever want to see your son, daughter, mother, brother, whatever, alive again, wire us, this amount of money by this day. They wire the money. Sometimes you get let go, sometimes you don't. But the Libyan Coast Guard has, been documented to be involved in this, at least factions of the Libyan Coast Guard, who really knows who is who. They've also Italy has adopted this policy of not really letting these rescue aid ships. So, we have a bunch of ships out in the Mediterranean Sea, and basically, kind of the terrible situation is that people weren't taking seaworthy crafts to try to cross the Mediterranean. They were taking little dinghies and packing them way too full. But one of the saving graces was that there were all these aid groups sailing around out there looking for these people, scooping them up and then bringing them to Europe. Well, Italy said, no, you're not bringing them to us anymore. And as a result of all these policies, the Italian government has been able to cut the migration pretty much to zero. I think 200 people or so made it in the first 2 months of 2019. So this is a substantial decrease over past years. A couple years before, that number would have been in the tens of thousands. Something that probably isn't getting enough credit is Haftar, the field marshal who leads the forces of eastern Libya, has taken a huge chunk of that country now, and I would say by landmass totals probably controls about 3/4 of it, and then, still not controlling the capital city and a couple significant cities in the west of the country. So his actual control may not be, 75% of the country, but, it has certainly probably brought some stability and consistency along the, southern borders of Libya. And then another thing, that is mentioned in this Wall Street Journal article on what has stemmed the flow of migrants is, the fact that I got out there of the brutality of what happens to the people trying to cross, especially, the people being tortured, ransomed, raped, and murdered. You only hear that so many times before you say it's probably not worth it to try, risk that journey. So I forgot to talk about this really important story, and then I went back at the end and I'm recording it. I'm going to put it after the Libya piece, but basically what we had is Donald Trump reversing course on Syria almost completely now, and it looks like we're going to keep 1,000 troops in that country. I can't say how disappointed I am. I was, and I'm sure many in my audience will remember that after Trump made this announcement at Will on the show, and we both expressed a good amount of optimism that, I think we're leaving Syria. Looking at the situation on the ground, what's 1,000 troops going to do? We certainly can't occupy all of eastern Syria with those 1,000 troops. There's still the fight against ISIS going on, and that's problematic. You're getting more and more rhetoric out of military officials and the Trump administration saying we have to stay to counter the ISIS threat that's turned back into an insurgency. And also, defeating what they've been calling the last pocket of ISIS. I mean, this is something that's been going on for like 9 months. We're on the last pocket of ISIS. And if you look at the number of people that have alleged to have surrendered from that area, fighters and otherwise, we're talking about, tens of thousands of people. The U.S. has dropped hundreds, if not thousands of bombs on this last pocket of ISIS. And yeah, it's still not defeated. And so from where I sit, it's kind of a head scratcher on how that hasn't happened yet. I haven't seen a good explanation. I know there's been some, I think like weather circumstantial issues, like dust storms have really allowed ISIS to, if not escape, at least, take a little bit more territory and then, they have more hostages to try to ransom off. And so I'm not saying it's been without its struggles, legitimately, but when you look at the number of bombs we dropped, the number of people that have surrendered, it's really hard to understand how that fight still hasn't been completed, if your goal is to just defeat ISIS there. The big question, I guess, with the 1,000 fighters is what are they going to do? When the number was 200 or 400, while, this still wasn't a good thing and I still want all U.S. troops out of Syria, if there's 200 troops on the U.S. northeast border with Iraq and 200 troops at Al-Tanaf, I think that's something that maybe for the, the status quo and the time being could still be worked around. But when you're talking about 1,000 troops, where those troops are going to be, I'm guessing a lot in eastern Syria. I think, we're looking at really preventing something from happening here that, could start to resolve the Syrian civil war on the east side of the Euphrates River. I guess one other thing I really have to, take some heat on is that I was saying back, maybe the Kurdish commanders and the Kurdish leadership, I thought they had clearly made a mistake by not negotiating with Assad sooner and not being more flexible with their negotiations with Assad now. Because if they're going to get all these U.S. troops to stay, it, I think, puts them in a much greater position of power. What does this mean for the U.S. relationship with Turkey is a real question. So I'm sure I'll talk about this more in the days to come. But I just, kind of did want to address it, especially since it's something that I feel like now I've been pretty wrong about and, very disappointing and big news. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. I hope everybody's enjoying this. Share it, recommend it, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, BitChute. Show should be pretty much everywhere anybody could listen to a podcast. My website is immersionnews.com, so check that out for a pretty regular news feed, big things going on in the world, organized in a cool way. You'll probably like it. And then check me out on minds.com/immersionnews.